Welcome to this predicted paper from Psychology Ninjas. This paper represents the best guess for the upcoming exams. Please use this paper in addition to your other revision. You can complete a unique version of this paper by going to our Psychology Ninjas site. Psychology Ninjas is full of free content to help you with your exams. You can save your scores with a free account. Ruel attends an international school where students are from 30 different countries across the world. He decides to categorise them as individualistic or collectivist. Ruel decides to conduct interviews with students about their attitudes towards different groups of people and their beliefs about how communities should operate. He uses ideological statements that focus on prejudicial views within a given culture or outside of a given culture to prompt conversations with participants. He reviews each interview, giving it an overall prejudice score out of 20, with a higher score showing more prejudice. State an operationalised directional hypothesis for Ruel's study, 2 marks. Our first piece of psychological knowledge in this question is operationalised. By this, we mean how are we going to measure the IV and the DV in this study. We also need to be aware that this is a directional hypothesis and we need to predict a certain outcome or direction for this study. As this is a STEM question, we need to take into account that this needs to link into Ruel's aim and be specific to this study in order to avoid being generic. Here's our response. Students from individualistic cultures will have a higher prejudice score out of 20 on ideological statements within a culture than students from collectivist cultures. We have a directional hypothesis here because we've got the word higher. By stating how we've measured culture in terms of being individualistic or collectivist, we've ensured that we've linked this into Ruel's study. We've also operationalised the DV in this study by saying the prejudice score is out of 20, and so we get both of our marks. Describe the risk management that Ruel would have had to have carried out to conduct his study into culture and prejudice, 2 marks. Here we have the command word describe, which means we need to give detail and extension to our response. We need to focus on strategies that we might use to control the risks that might be present in this study. All of this needs to be specific to Ruel's study, as all 2 marks in this question are application marks. Here's our response. Ruel should ensure that ideological statements do not have any foreseen adverse effects on the students in the school, making them feel uncomfortable raising concerns about prejudice in school. We've identified a risk that needs to be controlled in terms of the adverse effects of the ideological statements. We've ensured that we've linked this into the context by not only talking about prejudice, but referring to that this is in a school and the students need to be comfortable raising their concerns. Given that this question is worth 2 marks, we're then going to discuss an additional concern. Ruel should ensure that the interviews are conducted in a safe environment and that he has a plan if students are angry or deeply upset by the ideological statements given about each culture. By having a safe environment and a plan if things go wrong, we're demonstrating that we would manage the risks involved in this study. And finally, by identifying that the students might get upset by the ideological statements about a culture, we're demonstrating once again our understanding of the aim of this particular piece of research. 2 of Ruel's ideological statements are, people from our region are inherently more hardworking and trusting compared to those from other parts of the country, and I spend more time with people who have a similar background to me. Explain how one of Ruel's ideological statements could be improved, 2 marks. Here we've got the command word explain, which means we need to give some detail and extension to our response. We are focused here on an improvement, which is how we're going to make that statement better. It's critical that this is all linked in to Ruel's study. We get 1 mark for identifying an improvement. That improvement must be in context, so it becomes an application mark. Our second mark comes from justifying why is that an improvement for Ruel's study. Let's have a look at our response. Ruel could use more basic language such as naturally rather than inherently. We've got an identification of an improvement in terms of using basic language. But it's not until we give a suggestion for using naturally rather than inherently that we get our application mark here. Then we're going to explain why this is an improvement. Using clear language in his ideological statements will improve validity, as people will be discussing the statement rather than misunderstanding inherently. We've identified that this is improving the validity or the accuracy of our study. However, again, this needs to be in context, and that people might misunderstand inherently, and by changing our language, we will prevent that from happening. Milgram conducted research into obedience, including his 1963 baseline study. Identify and aim of Milgram's 1963 baseline study, 1 mark. The command word here is identify, so we're looking for you to state a particular piece of information. There is also some assumed psychological knowledge around an aim. This would be a research question or a particular area in which a psychologist is looking into. It's critical that our aim responds to baseline rather than any of Milgram's variations. Let's look at our response. To test the belief that Germans were different during the Holocaust. Here we have a clear aim identified, and this is focused in on Milgram's baseline that was particularly looking at Germans having a different personality during the Holocaust. Explain one weakness of Milgram's baseline study in terms of reliability, 2 marks. Here we have the command word explain, which means we need to give some detail and extension to our response. We've also got some assumed psychological knowledge here in terms of the word reliability. This is talking about the consistency of the study. Our response needs to focus on a weakness, and this is particular of Milgram's baseline study rather than any variations. We get 1 mark for identifying a particular weakness in terms of reliability. This is our AO1 mark. We get a 2nd mark for justifying why that is a problem, again in terms of reliability. Let's break down our answer. Perry suggests that some participants were given up to 20 verbal prods rather than the 4 stated in the procedure. We've clearly identified a problem with consistency here, talking about some participants getting 20 prods rather than just 4. Our next role in this response is to explain why that is a problem. The inconsistencies in the number of prods reduces the internal reliability as the procedure of Milgram's baseline is not standardised. We've clearly said that this is a problem inside the study and that it's now not consistent, that we have an unstandardised procedure and that different participants are experiencing this study in different ways. Mr. Kipling has asked his students to complete an experiment looking at plant growth using some written instructions. He has replicated this lesson with lots of students over the years and notices that some students diligently follow the instructions, whereas others do not. Whilst discussing it with a colleague, they suggest that culture may have an impact on why some students obey. Mr. Kipling has always believed that gender contributed to whether his students followed the instructions. Discuss how developmental psychology might explain the behaviour of Mr. Kipling's students, 8 marks. Here we have the command word discuss. This is asking us to explain and apply. We have some key psychological terminology here in terms of developmental psychology. This is looking at anything that would affect growing up or developing over a period of time. And we're looking to apply all of this to the information we've been given in the STEM about Mr. Kipling's students. So if we break our question down, half our marks are coming from AO1, which is our explanation of developmental psychology, looking at different ways in which people might develop. And then our rest of our marks are coming from AO2, which is how we've applied each of these factors to our particular STEM and the information we've been given. Our response is going to start with a factor that might affect development and how we grow up. We're going to look at culture first. Developmental psychology suggests that culture may have an impact on how children are brought up. Individualistic cultures are typified by an encouragement of self-dependence and personal autonomy. Collectivist cultures, on the other hand, value loyalty to the group as a whole and may put the needs of the group above their own individual desires. We've given a detailed description of how culture might affect development, specifically focusing on how children are socialised or brought up. We've explained key characteristics of both types of culture that we have identified within psychology. We're then going to apply culture to our information from our STEM to show application skills. Mr. Kipling's colleague may be correct that the students who follow the instructions within the plant growth experiment are from a collectivist culture who are more obedient to an authority figure. We've linked this into the STEM in two ways. We've identified that the colleague has identified culture as a factor, and we've explained how this might affect the plant growth experiment, particularly identifying that collectivist cultures may be more obedient and follow the instructions that Mr. Kipling has given. In order to get level 4 for our application, we need to use a wide variety of the STEM. In order to do so, we're going to tick off the colleague in order to show that I already used this as part of our application. We're then going to move back to explanation and talk about another factor that might affect developmental psychology. The Power Distance Index enables psychologists to examine the impact of culture on obedience. A high PDI score shows that a culture is more accepting of a social hierarchy and inequalities between groups within their society. A low PDI score suggests the inverse, that a fixed social order is less tolerated within a given society. We've discussed in detail here how culture, still as a developmental aspect of psychology, would impact these findings. We've talked here about the Power Distance Index being really clear about the difference between a high and low PDI score. Next, we're going to apply this to our STEM. Students who are from a high PDI country, such as Poland, are more likely to diligently follow the instructions, and they show higher levels of obedience to authority figures. Students who are from a low PDI country, e.g. Australia, are likely to change the procedure of the experiment. We've linked this back into following the instructions, saying which cultures are likely to follow the instructions and which aren't. We've also identified that those from a low PDI country may well change the procedure of the experiment. We're going to tick this off within our STEM. So some students diligently follow while others do not, showing we've applied a different part of the STEM to culture this time. The next step in our response is to go back to explanation, once again thinking about a different factor that might affect how children are brought up and how they might change over time. Developmental psychology suggests that gender has an impact on the socialisation of children over time. Women have historically been brought up to be more obedient, with harsh punishment by society if they are not obedient. We've identified gender as a factor, and importantly in terms of developmental psychology, we've talked about this having an impact on socialisation, how children are brought up, child rearing practices. We've also been specific here in talking about women or girls being brought up to be more obedient, and that's how it might have an impact in this particular social essay. And now it's time to apply this to our scenario. Mr. Kipling may be accurate in his assertion that gender is playing an impact. He may see that male students are less likely to follow the instructions as there are less social consequences if they are disobedient, and change the variables affecting plant growth. So we've linked this back into the STEM in two ways. We've talked about Mr. Kipling is accurate in his assertion, and so we know that we've read the STEM carefully. We've also talked about how this has impacted this particular experiment, in that men or boys are more likely to change the variables in the plant growth experiment. So here we can tick off Mr. Kipling has always believed that it's gender, again showing a wide variety of the STEM is being used within the application of our response. So then we're going to go to our final factor in terms of developmental psychology. Gender can create a different moral reasoning to justify obedience in different circumstances. An ethic of justice is more commonly seen in males who value equality and fairness, with destructive obedience being justified as an obligation to authority figures. An ethic of care is primarily shown by females who value interpersonal relationships and display destructive obedience to focus on the greater good. We've shown broad and detailed psychological knowledge here, accurately explaining both the ethic of justice and the ethic of care. We've linked this into gender as a factor affecting developmental psychology. And then we're going to link all of this back into the STEM. The reasons why the students follow Mr. Kipling's written instructions may be gendered, with boys following them in the interest of being scientific and fair in the plant experiment, whereas the girls may follow the instructions because they value their relationship with their teacher. We've applied both of these ethics directly to this experiment, that the boys are interested in being scientific and fair in their experiment, and the girls value their relationship with their teacher, clearly demonstrating the ethic of justice and the ethic of care. Because this is a discuss question, there's no need to evaluate or give conclusions in this response. We're going to go back up and tick this off our STEM. So we look here and we've seen 4 different ways in which we've used our STEM for the 4 different application marks we have available for this question. Draco is conducting a study to examine the capacity of memory. He decides to use a series of 20 pictures that are either landscapes, faces or objects within his study. Draco shows the images to the participants for 15 seconds each in a series of slides and repeats this 3 times. The participants then select whether the image appeared in the original slides from a 6-photo array. Describe how Draco could implement a match pairs design in his study. 2 marks. Here we've got the command word describe, which means we need to give details in our response, extending our discussion in order to maximise our explanation. We also need to bear in mind in this question that we need a matched pairs design, so we need to be matching our participants based on a participant variable in order to allocate them to the different groups. The final thing in decoding this question is that this is all about Draco and his study, so all of our discussion needs to link into his aim and what his study is about in order to show our application skills. Here's our answer. Draco could test the participants' ability to remember images on a different set of images and pair them based on their scores. He could then randomly allocate them to either the landscape, faces or objects condition. We need 2 separate links to the STEM for our 2 application marks. First of all, we've talked about matching the participants based on a specific variable that's appropriate for this study. Here we've gone for the ability to remember images. The other thing we need to do in a matched pairs design is then randomly allocate 1 member from each of our pairs. And we've talked again about how this links back into the study because we've identified the different conditions in Draco's study. Explain 1 strength of Draco using a matched pairs design in his study. 2 marks. Our command word is explain. This means we need to give extension and detail to our discussion. The question is asking us for 1 strength, and so we want to focus our time and energy on effectively giving 1 strength. We need to focus our strength on a matched pairs design for Draco's specific study and the aim of his research. This means that our marks break down into 1 mark for identifying that strength in the context of Draco's study, and then another mark, a justification mark of why that is a strength. It's important here we focus on the aim of the research rather than just name dropping and using Draco. Let's take a look at our response. It controls for some of the participants having a better memory naturally. We've identified a strength, and by discussing it in terms of memory, we've just about done enough to give some application to Draco's research. We then want to justify why this is a strength. This increases the validity of the findings and that the capacity of the memory for pictures is being tested rather than general abilities in memory. We've justified this control by talking about it in terms of validity or accuracy for this study. By discussing the accuracy of pictures rather than memory generally, we're ensuring that our strength is justified for Draco's aim. The results from Draco's investigation are shown in Table 1. Complete Table 1 and calculate the Mann-Whitney U-test for Draco's study, 4 marks. Here we have the command word calculate. This is looking for us to complete this table and give an observed or calculated value for this particular test. We're looking at a Mann-Whitney U-test here, and so that's going to have a specific procedure. The scores have already been ranked for us, and our first job is to total up those rank columns. So adding up all the figures for the ranks for landscapes and also adding up all the figures for the ranks for objects and faces. Our next job is to substitute the formulas for UA and UB. These formulas can be found in the front of our exam booklet. The first thing that I would do is put some brackets in our formula to make it a bit more understandable. The first brackets are going to go around the first part of our formula, and we've got NA multiplied by NB. And then we're going to add that to the second part of our formula and take that away from the third part of our formula. We're going to start by looking at NA. NA is the number of participants in group A. So in this case, this would be 6. We're going to multiply that by the number of participants in group B, and in this case, it is also 6 participants. Let's put a bracket around that to keep things neat and tidy. It's worth bearing in mind that there doesn't have to be an equal number of participants in each group because it's an independent group's design. And then we're going to go to the next part of our formula. So we know we've got NA, that's the number of participants in group A. So that's going to be 6 multiplied by NA plus 1, which is 7. And we're going to divide that by 2. And then we're going to put in the last part of our calculation. This sign here means the sum of. So we're looking for the sum of the ranks of group A. So we're going to minus 35 in this instance because this is the sum of the ranks of group A. And so we're going to write this out again, completing all of our calculations. So UA is 36 plus, and then we're going to do 6 times 7, which is 42. And then we're going to divide that by 2, which is 21, and minus 35 from that. And so 36 plus 21 minus 35 is 22. And that answer goes in where it says UA, and that's 22. So to break down our formula, we're going to put in some brackets around each component, exactly as we have done for UA. And then we're going to substitute that formula for numbers. So NA is what we have looked at before. So we know that that is 6 participants. And then we're going to times that by UB, which is also 6 participants. And then we're going to add that to the next part of our formula. So NB is 6 multiplied by 6 plus 1, or NB plus 1, which is 7, divided by 2. And then this time we're going to take away the ranks, or the sum of the ranks of group B. So that is 43. And so we're going to put all of these calculations in. So UB is 6 times 6, which is 36, plus 6 times 7, which is 42, divided by 2, and that's 21, minus 43. And so that is 14, and 14 is going where we have UB, so we're going to pop that in there as well. For our U value, we're comparing UA and UB, and whichever of those is smaller is going to be our U value. Here 14 is less than 22, and so 14 becomes our calculated U value. Draco used a directional one-tailed hypothesis. The calculated value was 14, and the number of participants was 6 for each group. State whether Draco's data was significant at p equals less than or equal to 0.05. 1 mark. Here we have the command word state. This is looking for a single sentence to identify a response in relation to our question. We need to identify whether these results are significant. There's some additional information that we need to be aware of within this question. That we are using a directional hypothesis, that the number of participants was 6, and the level of significance is p equals 0.05. For a Mann-Whitney U, we need to be aware that there are different tables for different tests, and these are all in the front of our exam booklet. We want the level of significance to be 0.05 for a one-tailed or directional hypothesis. We have 6 participants in Group A, so we're going along this way, and 6 participants in Group B, which we're going down this way. This means that our critical value is 7 for this particular study. This is going to be the first thing that we record within our response, that the critical value from the table is 7. And then we need to compare this to the calculated value in our STEM, which is 14. Within our response, 14 is bigger than 7. We then need to make a determination about whether these results are significant. For us, our results here are not significant. This is because the observed value, 14, is not less than the critical value of 7. Don't forget, it's always at the bottom of all the tables which way round it needs to be significant. So whether the observed value needs to be greater or smaller than the critical value to be significant. Geetha has been invited to take part in a case study looking at the impact of childhood experiences on brain activity, including the role of an urban environment. Describe what would be involved for Geetha to be a participant in this case study, 3 marks. Here we have the command word describe, which means we need to give an extension or development to our discussion to take it from a state into a describe point. Within this question, we also need to think about what would be involved. So we're thinking about it from the participant's point of view. What would they have to do if they were in this case study? Our final component in breaking down this question is what would be involved for Geetha. So we need to link this back into the aim of this particular piece of research and make all our examples relevant to the STEM. Let's jump into our response. Geetha may have a PET scan to see which regions of her brain are red, showing high levels of activity when she is recalling an event from her childhood. We've explained what might be involved in this case study by identifying that she might have a PET scan. We've also linked it back into the STEM by talking about high levels of activity in her brain being shown in red. This focuses on our STEM by talking about brain activity. Let's move on to a next point that she might expect. A psychologist could collect quantitative data by asking Geetha to complete the digit span test to record the capacity of her memory. We've also done just enough to link this into context by talking about memory, which is what the researcher is looking for. And then we're going to move into a final way for our 3rd mark in this 3-mark question. Geetha may be asked to recall an event from her childhood in detail and then asked to recall the event 3 weeks later to compare her accounts. Again, we've clearly got what she might expect from this study by being asked to recall a specific event. And we've got it linked into the details of this study by talking about a childhood event, which is ticked off in our STEM by the impact of childhood. Evaluate Tolving's theory of long-term memory, 8 marks. Here we have the command word evaluate, which is sneaky because we need to both explain and evaluate for our 8 marks in this question. We have 4 marks available for our explanation. In this question, what we're looking to explain is Tolving's theory of long-term memory. We have an equal weighting for our evaluation, another 4 marks for our strengths and weaknesses of this particular theory of memory. We're going to start by explaining a concept within Tolving's long-term memory. Episodic memory is the recall of events, such as your 16th birthday party. This means that it is time-stamped, meaning that you remember where and when it happened. As such, you can time travel back to these events and revisit them. Single episodes include several elements interwoven to form a single memory. Episodic memories have an autonoetic consciousness, where we are aware that these are our personal experience, but the recall of details within the event may not be accurate. We've clearly identified a concept within Tolving's theory of long-term memory by identifying a particular type of long-term memory, episodic memory. We've given specific details here, talking about these being about events, that these are time-stamped, and that we can time travel. We've gone even further by discussing their autonoetic consciousness and how this has broken down in terms of our episodic memories. We're then going to move into evaluation. There is empiricism for different types of LTM supporting Tolving's theory. Here we're showing our psychological knowledge by using the term empiricism. This means evidence, so here we're looking for supporting research for Tolving's theory. We're going to explain this with some research evidence. HM was unable to form new episodic memories, as never recognised Corkin, and his semantic memory was also severely affected. However, much of his procedural memory remained intact. We're giving clear findings in terms of different types of long-term memory. The episodic memories were problematic for HM, as were semantic memory. That, however, procedural memory was intact, showing a clear difference between the different types of long-term memory. We're going to elaborate with a counter-argument. However, the use of brain-damaged patients, such as HM, to support the theory fails to account for the unique nature of brain injuries. Furthermore, HM did have cued semantic and episodic memories, suggesting that the nature of each type of long-term memory may be more complex. It's important here that we don't just give a generic problem with case studies. Here we've said why this has an impact on this particular theory. that we aren't going to have an understanding because of the unique nature of brain injury, and a different finding saying that actually HM had similar natures in semantic and episodic memory if they were cued, if they were given prompts. We're going to complete this evaluation paragraph by giving a link or mini judgment. There is external reliability in the findings from research that there are subcomponents within long-term memory. Where we're discussing external reliability, we're talking about the consistency of findings across different studies with different participants. We're going to move back into explanation now. Semantic memories are our knowledge of the world. For example, Paris is the capital of France. It includes our knowledge of things and the meaning of words, making it essential for language. It is not time-stamped, so we don't remember when we learnt facts about Henry VIII's wives, but we do know the information. We've identified our knowledge of semantic memory, giving specific examples. Now, these could be any examples about factual knowledge. We've gone for Paris being the capital of France. It's also important here that we talk about them not being time-stamped, so we're not able to time travel in our semantic memory. We're going to move into evaluation here, and we're going to start to talk about how Tulving's theory has problems. Tulving's theory of long-term memory lacks validity. Here we're saying that this theory lacks accuracy. And we're going to explain this point by saying studies conducted on long-term memory lack mundane realism, as the task set are not realistic. The reliance on word lists to test the differences between episodic and semantic memory overlook other cues that are significant in recall. We're showing our psychological knowledge here by talking about mundane realism. This is the task rather than the location of the study. It's also really important here we've explained why this is significant, and that this reliance on word lists isn't really testing the difference between episodic and semantic memory. We're going to elaborate in this paragraph by giving a further weakness. Moreover, Tulving overlooks that episodic and semantic memories work together and are not unitary stores within long-term memory. The interaction between stores is shown by amnesia patients who knew past experiences had happened but could not re-experience them. Where we're talking about unitary stores, we're saying that episodic and semantic memory aren't discrete and different, that they're working together. We've explored this further by talking about evidence from amnesia patients. We're going to complete this paragraph with a link and a mini judgment. The refinement of Tulving's theory to acknowledge the interaction between stores shows the cumulative nature of psychological knowledge. Here we're using a term within psychology as a science, that knowledge is cumulative, that it builds on past experiences and is refined in order to reflect new research and findings. We're going to go back to explanation once again in order to show developed and thorough knowledge. Procedural memory stores memory on how to do things and is acquired through repetition. When learning skills, our memories start explicit with a conscious awareness of how to do things but become implicit over time. When they become automatic, it enables our attention to be given to other tasks while performing everyday skills. We've shown our understanding of procedural memory by talking about that this is learning skills, how to do things. These start explicit and become implicit over time. The fact that we're discussing their automatic nature, especially when skills are established, means we're showing deep and thorough knowledge of this particular type of long-term memory. In our interwoven approach between our explanation and evaluation, it's now time to go back to evaluation. Tulving's theory of long-term memory is reductionist. Here we've used a key term within psychology talking about reductionism, that this is an oversimplified explanation of memory. We're going to explain this further. Tulving's original theory did not explain procedural memory. HM learnt new motor skills after his brain injury, such as drawing a figure. Here we're making reference to the 1974 theory of long-term memory from Tulving, which we might have our questions specifically about. We've also linked this into key findings from HM and his procedural memory being developed after he had had his brain injury. We're going to elaborate this with a different theory that might be preferable to Tulving's theory. Therefore, reconstructive memory might be a better explanation of memory. It explains why cued memories are retrievable, as memories that are consistent with our existing schema are likely to be associated with different parts of the brain. Whenever we introduce a different theory, it's really important that we say why this theory is better, that this explains cued memories being retrievable, which we've already made reference to when we talked about the cued nature of episodic and semantic memory that wasn't addressed by Tolving's theory. We're going to make a final link here to give another mini judgment. Tolving's theory of long-term memory therefore lacks external validity and the ability to explain how memory operates in the real world. By referencing external validity, we're saying that this is not accurate and doesn't reflect how memory might work in the real world. Given that our command word is evaluate, we need to come to a balanced conclusion at the end. HM's case study provides a research foundation for Tolving's theory of long-term memory. Tolving's theory lacks validity due to the unrealistic design of research and the reliance on word lists as an assessment of memory. And finally, Tolving's theory is reductionist, which makes it easier to test but an incomplete explanation of memory. Agatha has recently suffered from a stroke. It has affected her ability to move her left arm and leg, which means that she is going to physical therapy to help her to walk. Using your knowledge of the central nervous system, describe why Agatha's stroke has affected her in this way. 2 marks. Here we have the command word describe. This means we need to be detailed in how we're explaining our particular knowledge. There's some assumed psychological knowledge in this question in terms of the central nervous system. This means the brain and the brainstem. As this is a STEM question, all of our marks need to be linked back to Agatha, so we need to use 2 parts of the STEM for our 2 application marks. Let's explore our response. It is likely that Agatha's motor cortex has been damaged as she is having difficulties with walking. We've identified the role of the motor cortex, but it's more important here that we've talked about her difficulties with walking. We can tick this off in terms of our STEM to show our application skills. We want 2 different parts of the STEM for our 2 marks for application. Let's move on to our second mark. Agatha has had a stroke in the right hemisphere of her brain, as lateralization means that the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, affecting her left arm and leg. We've shown our knowledge of the central nervous system here by talking about lateralization, that our right hemisphere controls the left-hand side of our body and the left hemisphere controls the right-hand side of our body. We've linked this into Agatha's STEM by talking about her left arm and leg having an issue since her stroke, and we can tick this off in our STEM as well. We can clearly see from our STEM that we've done our 2 pieces of application for our 2 marks, as 2 different parts of the STEM have been highlighted. Explain one strength of evolutionary explanations of aggression. 2 marks. This question has the command word explain. This is looking for us to give some detail and extension within our response. Here we're looking to give a strength, and we're giving a strength of evolutionary explanations of aggression. We get 1 mark for identifying a strength, and that's an AO1 mark. We also get another mark for justifying why that is a strength. Let's have a look at this within a response. One strength is that evolutionary explanations explain gender differences in aggressive behaviour. Men show aggression by being strong hunters, increasing their survival, whereas women tend and befriend in order to protect their offspring. Manson and Wrangham's study of chimpanzees supports these gender differences in behaviour. We've clearly identified a strength in terms of gender differences, explaining how men and women differ in their aggression. The use of research that demonstrates this supports this strength and justifies why it is a strength for this particular explanation. Explain one weakness of evolutionary explanations of aggression. 2 marks. Here we have the command word explain, which means we need to give detail within our response, developing this in terms of our explanation. We need to explain a weakness, focusing on evolutionary explanations of aggression. So our 2 marks break down into 1 mark for identifying a particular weakness of this explanation, and our second mark comes from justifying why that is a weakness. Let's have a look at a response. One weakness is that there are cultural variations in aggression, suggesting that evolutionary explanations lack validity. The Kung Sang are rarely aggressive as it is discouraged from childhood, whereas the Yanomami use aggression to gain status, making aggressive displays commonplace. We have identified a problem with evolutionary explanations in the discussion of cultural variations, because if evolutionary explanations were correct, then we should have a similar level of universal behaviours in terms of aggression. We've particularly said this is a problem because that means that this lacks validity and lacks accuracy. We've extended and justified our statement about cultural differences by talking about two different examples. We've gone for the Kung San and the Yanomami. However, you could use other examples of cultural variations in aggression to justify this point. Describe how individual differences might have an impact in biological psychology. 4 marks. The command word is describe, which means we need to give detail and extension within our discussion here. This question has some assumed psychological knowledge in terms of individual differences. This is talking about differences between participants. What makes someone unique? What is affecting their behaviour? These individual differences are all focused on biological psychology. Now, we could talk about this in terms of aggression, but that doesn't necessarily have to be our focus in terms of behaviour. We're looking for the impact of individual differences in 4 different ways for the 4 marks available in this question. Now it's time to go through an answer. Personality is based on individual differences and is affected by the socialisation process in childhood. Socialisation determines whether the biological basis an individual has in terms of their nervous system results in someone being law-abiding or not. Extroverts have an underactive nervous system and crave excitement, so may engage in risky behaviour with recreational drugs. Within our response, we've identified an individual difference in terms of personality being affected by socialisation or how children are brought up. We've been clear here how this has an impact in terms of biology, looking at the nervous system. We've ensured that this is linked into behaviours in biological psychology by talking about its impact on recreational drug use. Here we've clearly identified an individual difference and discussed at length the impact on biological psychology and specific behaviours. This would get us 2 of our 4 marks. Now it's time to discuss a different individual difference. The causes of traumatic brain injuries vary and the resulting brain damage is unique. Therefore, the impact of damage to the brain on behaviour is difficult to predict. Although Charles Whitman had a tumour on his amygdala, that does not mean that all people with similar tumours will commit murder. This time, our individual difference is traumatic brain injury, and we've been clear how this might have an impact and vary from person to person. We've used Charles Whitman as a particular piece of research to identify the impact on behaviour. In this case, we've looked at murder or aggression in terms of acting on this and the role of the amygdala in this particular behaviour. Both of our individual differences are discussed in detail with clear links into biological psychology, gaining us 4 marks for this response. Evaluate your chosen contemporary study, 8 marks. This particular response is going to look at Brendigan et al. Here we have the command word evaluate, which means we need to both explain and evaluate our content within our response. We get 4 marks for our explanation of a particular study. This means we need to discuss the aim, procedure, findings and conclusions for Brendigan et al.'s research. There are also 4 marks for evaluating this study, giving strengths and weaknesses particular to this particular piece of research. We're going to start by explaining the aim and sample. Brendigan et al.'s aim was to discover the extent to which social and physical aggression are influenced by genetic and environmental influences. They selected 234 pairs of twins from the Quebec newborn twin study, ensuring that they had monozygotic and dizygotic twins of both genders. We've discussed the nature of the research question, looking at both social and physical aggression. We've given some specific details in terms of the sample that were selected. It's absolutely fine to use the abbreviation MZ and DZ for monozygotic and dizygotic twins within our response. And then we're going to consider the nature of our sample for our evaluation. Participant variables were considered and controlled as extraneous variables by Brendigan et al. We've identified extraneous variables here, and these have been controlled. As such, we can say that the independent variable can have a causal relationship on the dependent variable. We're going to explain this to give detail to our response. A large sample of children were selected for the study to explain both social and genetic factors, with female and male monozygotic and dizygotic twins included in the sample to prevent androcentrism. Androcentrism is when a sample is male-dominated, which affects both the representativeness and the generalisability of the conclusions that have been drawn. We're then going to counter this to elaborate. However, the sample is ethnocentric, based on the Quebec twin registry, and reflects individualistic values on aggression. When we're talking about ethnocentric, we're talking about a study being based on one culture. We've been clear here how this impacts the results for this particular study, in that aggression might be something that is culturally relative. To complete our evaluation, we're going to give a link or judgment. Aggression is culturally relative depending on social acceptance of social and physical aggression, therefore findings may not be generalisable. We've clearly linked this into the aim of the study, talking again about physical and social aggression. It's clear here we've also linked culturally relative and generalisable to show how this methodological issue has an impact on this particular piece of research. From here, we're going to go back into our explanation. Teacher ratings for aggression were assessed on a 3-point scale, never, sometimes, always, for both social items, spreading nasty rumours, and physical items, bites of aggression. Peer ratings were also taken. It was checked to make sure that the peer recognised everybody. Then they were asked to nominate someone on the page who best matched the description on social items, tells others not to play with a child, and physical items, gets into fights of aggression. We've given a detailed explanation of the procedure here, talking both about the teachers' ratings and how the peers were rating. Giving examples of both social and physical levels of aggression shows a clear understanding and deep knowledge of this particular piece of research. We're then going to move into evaluation once again, making a point this time about reliability. Brendigan et al. Has a standardised procedure increasing internal reliability. Internal reliability is the consistency within a study, that the study is the same for every single participant. A standardised procedure giving internal reliability is something we can use again and again, but to ensure we're not generic, we need to give some specific details to explain this point for this particular piece of research. For Brendigan et al., they used rating scales with standard items for each of the teachers and peers, with both social items, spreads nasty rumours, and physical items, bites. By outlining specific social items and physical items, we've shown a clear understanding of this particular piece of research, ensuring that our strength here is not generic. We're then going to elaborate with a counter-argument. The positive correlation between social and physical aggression was not supported by ratings from teachers and peers. However, Hutchins and Mednick study of 14,000 adoptees found a positive correlation between criminal convictions for violence between fathers and adopted boys, supporting genetic explanations. Our discussion of a positive correlation means that as one thing increases, another thing increases. Here, our teacher ratings aren't saying that as social aggression increases, physical aggression increases. We've gone from a further counter-argument here with our research from Hutchinson and Mednick. It's time to link this all together and back to our question by giving a mini conclusion. Additional research into genetics and variants associated with aggression, MAOA, support Brendigan's conclusions about a genetic predisposition of some to aggression. Where we're talking about a genetic predisposition, we're talking about more aggression in monozygotic twins or a consistent correlation with monozygotic twins rather than dizygotic twins. We're going to go back to our explanation and we're going to give some findings for this research. 20% of teacher and 23% of peer ratings of social aggression showed that genetic factors were influential. However, physical aggression was mostly explained by genetics, but social was mostly explained by non-shared environmental influences. So the form of aggression, whether it was social or physical, is more affected by modelling, but genetic factors can predispose some children to aggressive behaviour in general. We've given findings here in terms of our specific percentages. We've also given findings in terms of outcomes for physical aggression being mainly explained by genetics and social by non-shared environmental influences. We've also given an overall conclusion here, with both of these types of aggression being affected by modelling. We're going back into evaluation and we're going to look at application now. The identification of aggressive traits in children has applications to society. By discussing the applications of research, we're suggesting that we can use these in order to help or even control members of our society. From here, we're going to explain a particular intervention. Brendigan et al.'s work suggests that interventions in early years should focus on reducing physical aggression as a precursor to social aggression. You could give examples of specific interventions. Here we focused on early years, which reflects the children in our sample from Brendigan et al.'s research. We're going to elaborate by saying why we should conduct these interventions. The positive correlation found between physical and social aggression suggests that further work into factors that block the path between physical and social aggression is needed. We focused here on this positive correlation. Although this wasn't borne out with all the findings, overall we're suggesting that there is a positive correlation between physical and social aggression. We're going to give a link and a mini judgment here to complete this evaluation paragraph. The impact on early intervention shows the external validity of the findings for social and physical aggression. Where we're discussing external validity, we're suggesting that these findings have applications outside this particular piece of research and they're accurate in helping society. Given that the command word is evaluate, we're going to give a balanced conclusion to complete this essay. The range of twins included in the study and the consideration of gender enables Brendigan et al.'s findings to be generalised. There are inconsistencies between Brendigan et al.'s statistical analysis and ratings about the overlap between social and physical aggression, reducing reliability. And finally, the positive application of these findings for society shows the contribution of psychological knowledge. Mr. Causa decides to set his English class a challenging poem. Farouk is struggling to understand the concept of alliteration. He notices that Eleonora confidently applies the concept, using a silly song to remember what different poetry devices are. A psychologist decides to conduct an observation of Mr. Causa's class. Explain how the psychologist can ensure that their observation is scientific, 3 marks. We have the command word explain, which means we need to give detail and extension in our discussion here. There is also some assumed psychological knowledge here in terms of features of science, and we would need to incorporate these into our response. Because there is a stem here, we need all of our 3 marks to be application. We need to link this into the psychologist looking at Mr. Causa's class and the specific details within the information that we've been given. Let's have a look at a response. The psychologist could use a directional hypothesis in observing learning in English, as Bandura et al. Have already conducted research into the role of modelling and imitation in learning. Here we have a clear feature of science in terms of hypothesis testing. We've also linked this back into our STEM by talking about this being in the English lesson and an understanding of the previous research in observational learning with Bandura et al. We can tick this off in our STEM in terms of the English class, so we know that we've used different parts of the STEM within our application. We're then going to look at another feature of science. The psychologist should only conduct their observation with Mr. Causa and this class to control prior beliefs of ability being an extraneous variable. We've shown another feature of science here by talking about high levels of control. We've shown control and linked this into the STEM in terms of beliefs about ability, because here we're trying to understand a concept and that might have an impact on our conclusions. For our 3rd mark, we're going to link in a 3rd feature of science. The psychologist could create an observation schedule of expected classroom behaviours to aid replication. We've identified replication as an additional feature of science. We've linked this into the STEM in terms of expected classroom behaviours, and we can tick this off in our STEM as well. Explain one strength of your chosen contemporary study, 2 marks. In this instance, our contemporary study is Becker et al. This question has the command word explain, which means we need to extend and give detail in terms of our discussion for this response. This question is focused on one strength of this particular piece of research, and so we need to ensure that we're not generic in our discussions, so nothing that we're explaining here could be linked into any other particular research study. This question breaks down into 2 marks. We get 1 mark for identifying a strength of Becker et al.'s research. Our second mark comes from explaining why that is a strength and why that is important for Becker et al.'s study. It's time to jump over to our response now. By using the EAT26 questionnaire to assess eating behaviour, Becker et al. Had a standardised procedure that had high levels of internal reliability. A strong positive correlation of 0.9 shows the consistency of assessment of each item on the questionnaire. Here we've identified that the standardised procedure is a strength. It's important here that this isn't generic, given lots of studies have a standardised procedure. We've made this specific to Becker's study by talking about the use of the EAT26 questionnaire and explaining that this gives it high internal reliability or consistency within the study. We've justified this with additional research, showing that the items had a strong positive correlation of 0.9. Here we're using that correlational coefficient with it being a positive number and close to 1, showing that a consistent assessment on each item. This gives us both our identification and justification mark for this strength. Explain one weakness of your chosen contemporary study, 2 marks. In this instance, our weakness is going to be of Becker et al.'s research. In this question, we have the command word explain, which means we need to give detail and extension in our response. The question is only looking for one weakness of this contemporary study, and so giving more than one would just be wasting time. However, to get our 2 marks available, we first need to identify a particular weakness of this study. Again, it's important that this is only for this study and is linked back into the aim, procedure, findings or conclusion of Becker et al.'s research. We also get a mark for justifying or explaining why that problem is a problem for the aims of this particular study. It's now time to deconstruct a response. The use of the EAT26 questionnaire lacks predictive validity for eating disorders. Nunez et al. Found that it was a poor predictor of eating disorders in young women from southern Brazil, with results not being influenced by the low prevalence of eating disorders in Brazil. We've identified a problem with this study is that it lacks predictive validity in its use of the EAT26 questionnaire. This is where we're being specific to Becker's research. Where we're talking about predictive validity, we're saying the ability to use this questionnaire to predict outcomes for eating disorders in the long term. The response here has identified particular research to back this up or support it. However, if we talked about this being a poor predictor of eating disorders for women in South Brazil, we would still get our marks because it's clear what study we're talking about. Even the low prevalence, i.e. the low numbers of eating disorders in this country, weren't having an impact on its predictive validity. Marianne is about to adopt a new puppy. She is keen to train it to do tricks so that they can compete in local dog shows. Marianne has been learning about reinforcement in her psychology lessons and is keen to use different types of reinforcement with different tricks to see which is the most successful in training her puppy. Discuss how properties of reinforcement could be used to train Marianne's dog, 8 marks. Here we have the command word discuss. In a discuss question, we need to explain and apply. There's no need to evaluate and there's no need to give a conclusion with this command word. This is focused on properties of reinforcement or schedules of reinforcement. There are 4 marks available for our explanation of different schedules of reinforcement. This is also a STEM question, and so we need to link our examples back to Marianne's dog. There are a further 4 marks available for our application and our different examples that we use. It's really important here that all our examples are pertinent to our STEM and a dog in this instance. So we're going to start with our first explanation. Primary reinforcement uses a reinforcer that is naturally or biologically desired. Secondary reinforcement is the process of associating something else with something that is biologically desired. we've given a clear explanation of the difference between primary and secondary reinforcers. That primary reinforcers are naturally occurring, and for secondary, it's the association between something that isn't normally giving a response, such as a token, and something that would give a normal response. From here, we're going to give some application and link this into the STEM. Marianne should start by using food to train her puppy to sit down or follow her instructions. She could combine the presentation of a dog treat with saying "good doggy," so that this can become a secondary reinforcer over time. We've got clear and appropriate examples here, with a dog treat being used as a primary reinforcer and the phrase "good doggy" as a secondary reinforcer. And then it's time to move back to explanation and talk about another schedule of reinforcement. A ratio reinforcement schedule is when a reinforcer is given after a certain number of the desired behaviours have been seen. This could be a fixed number of behaviours, for example every 5 times, or this could be a variable where the reinforcer is given an unpredictable number of times, but this varies around the mean. It's important here that we give an explanation rather than just bung a whole load of key terms in here. So we clearly understand what ratio reinforcement is because we know that this is a certain number of behaviours. We've given a clear example of both fixed, and we've talked about a variable reinforcement schedule as well. We're going to go back to application once again, applying this to our STEM. Marianne could use a fixed ratio reinforcement schedule to get her puppy to go through a tunnel. Every 3 times the puppy successfully goes through the tunnel, a dog treat should be given. Marianne could use a variable with a different trick, such as jumping over a bar. She could use a random number generator to select the number of times needed for a treat to be presented. We've talked about a range of appropriate tricks here, with the puppy going through a tunnel for fixed ratio and jumping over a bar for variable. Here we've talked about different tricks for the dogs to do, and we can tick this off in the STEM to show a varied use of the STEM in our application skills. We're going to go back to explanation now in order to show detailed and thorough psychological knowledge. A continuous reinforcement schedule is when a reward is presented every time the desired behaviour is shown. A partial schedule is when an additional variable, either the amount of behaviours or the time, is used to determine whether the reinforcer is given. We've made a clear distinction here between continuous, presented every time, and partial, that there is a variable, either the amount of behaviours or the time, which dictates when the reward is given. And we're going to go back to application once again. At the start of puppy training, Mariam should continuously reward the puppy with a treat each time it sits to make an association between her voice command and the behaviour. Once this is established, Marianne could then use partial reinforcement to walk over a small bridge, rewarding the puppy at various times. So we've talked again about a range of behaviours appropriate for the puppy. First of all, it's sitting on command and that being continuously rewarded, and then moving into a trick where the puppy walks over a small bridge. We're going back up to our STEM here, and we can tick off competing in a local dog show as part of our STEM. Walking over a small bridge would be something we'd see regularly in dog shows. We're going to talk about an additional aspect of properties of reinforcement. Shaping is used to encourage complex behaviours, using reinforcement at each part to build them together towards the final desired behaviour. We've shown a clear understanding of shaping in that this is breaking behaviours down and then building them up together in order for more complex behaviours to be successfully conditioned. And then, like we have done before, we need to apply this. A dog course is likely to involve several different tasks that the dog needs to complete. Marianne will need to break down each part of the course, shaping and conditioning the dog to complete it. If a task is complicated, like going up, along and down a bridge, each part may also need to be conditioned. We've shown a clear understanding once again of what's involved for this particular scenario, breaking the course down into several different components, but also specific tasks in terms of talking about that bridge task once again. We've linked this back into the STEM by talking about training her puppy to do new things. We can clearly see we've used different parts of the STEM here to show a holistic, detailed and thorough application. Assess social control as an issue in learning theories, 8 marks. This question has the command word assess, which means we need to explain, evaluate, and form judgments in relation to the content. Our question is focused on social control as an issue in debate within psychology, and we're having to explain this particular debate. There are 4 marks available for our explanation, talking about the content involved within social control. The focus of our discussion needs to be on learning theories, and our examples need to come from there. Our remaining 4 marks are about evaluating, giving examples of where social control in learning theories has been positive and where it has been used to abuse or to harm society. We're going to start by explaining an aspect of social control. The use of psychological knowledge to control can be overt, with members of society being aware that psychological techniques are being applied and still be positive. Although they are openly acknowledged, we can also be unaware of their impact or dismiss their influence on our behaviour. Here we've got a range of psychological knowledge, talking about the use of social control being overt or known or open to society. We're also saying here that the use of social control could be positive, and therefore we're presenting a balanced argument. It's now time to give some examples in terms of learning theories. The use of social learning theory can have a positive impact to society, with role models portraying behaviour that are beneficial to society. We've clearly identified a particular theory in terms of social learning theory, and demonstrated that this could have a positive impact in terms of the use of role models. We now need to explore this with an example. The Sabido method has been used to tackle social issues within telenovelas and soap operas to suggest coping strategies. Recent examples that feature characters who are transitioning from male to female and female to male have shed light on the transgender community and facilitate discussions. We've clearly illustrated our psychological knowledge by identifying the Sabido method. You could use any example here as long as it's talking about controlling behaviour, changing it for the positive and helping society. We're now going to move into a counter-argument in order to develop logical chains of reasoning. However, the exposure to Western role models and eating behaviours has had a negative impact in Fiji. Becker et al. Reported dysfunctional eating increasing from 12.7% to 29.2% between 1995 and 1998, following the introduction of TV. Our discussions here show how role models might have a negative effect, controlling behaviour of individuals, but not for positive reasons. We've clearly identified Becker et al.'s research, and we've given specific findings to illustrate detailed knowledge of this particular study in the negative aspects of social learning theory and the use of role models. To conclude our evaluation, we're going to form a judgment. By understanding how behaviours are formed, psychologists can take active steps to reduce them, having a positive, although controlling impact on society. In order to respond to our command word assess, we formed a clear judgment here, saying learning theories are positive but controlling. In our response, we're now going to return to explanation once again. Psychology has the ability to control behaviour through an understanding of reward power. Individuals with reward power have the ability to give rewards when others comply to specific behaviours, determining which behaviours are viewed as socially acceptable. Learning theories have also given individuals an understanding of coercive power, with the ability to deliver punishments and decide which behaviours are punished. We've clearly understood social control as a debate, discussing 2 types of power, reward power and coercive power, both with links to learning theories. It's time to return to evaluation once again. The development of operant conditioning and the impact that behavioural modification can have on society has given an understanding of how to shape and control human behaviour. We've identified operant conditioning as a specific theory that would have an impact in terms of reward and coercive power. We've also talked about this in terms of behavioural modification, which is where we might start to control the actions of people. Let's explain this further. The use of behaviour modification is open to abuse by conditioning the client to whatever behaviours the therapist considers normal, that might be in conflict with the beliefs and preferences of that individual. The use of primary reinforcers, food and shelter to modify behaviour are not permitted. We've clearly connected our ideas of reward and coercive power with behaviour modification, that it is the therapist that has the ability to shape behaviour and consider what is normal. We've also identified that primary reinforcers wouldn't be permitted to be used for ethical reasons. In order to give a balanced response, we now need to discuss the positives of operant conditioning. On the other hand, Latham and Dossett found that the introduction of a variable ratio of pay rather than a fixed ratio of pay increased productivity. When mountain beaver trappers were given more money per trapped beavers if they guessed the colour of a marble correctly, they trapped more beavers. We've now identified how this might be positive in terms of change in behaviour, and we've identified research here. The fact that we are using a variable ratio of pay, and that's having an impact on giving more productivity in terms of trapping more beavers, shows the positives of this behaviour modification technique. We now need to link this all together in order to come to a judgment. Although not inherently problematic, sharing an understanding of changing behaviours using the principles of operant conditioning can lead to an imbalance of power and destructive control of others. We've clearly identified that operant conditioning has the ability to be more controlling and open to abuse. It is important here that we haven't said that these are always problematic, but it depends how they're being used. It's time to return to our explanation of this debate. Psychology can also be used as a form of social control through the expert power that an understanding of human behaviour gives clinicians. The displaying of credentials and awards suggests that the practitioner has expertise and knowledge of clinical conditions and behaviour that is trusted and followed. We've shown further detail in our understanding of social control as a debate by discussing the role of expert power. The expertise gives us power to control other people's behaviour. Let's return to evaluation. The directive nature of therapies demonstrate the expert power of clinicians to shape behaviour. We've shown our psychological knowledge here by talking about directive, and this is particularly true for therapies, that if a clinician is being directive in their behaviour, they are directing that client to what to do or not do in terms of changing their behaviour. We're going to explore this now in terms of therapies that are in learning theories. Flooding is highly directive, as the therapist decides when the patient has been counter-conditioned from their phobia and is responsible for their care in the prolonged period of exposure to their fear. Flooding is a particular therapy in learning theories and is based on the principles of classical conditioning. We've been really clear here how it is directive and how the patient is at the mercy of the therapist in terms of the counter-conditioning. It's important here we talk about the prolonged period of exposure in which that patient would be under the responsibility of the therapist. In order to be balanced in our response, we're now going to give a counter-argument. However, systematic desensitisation is less directive, as the patient and therapist work together to formulate the anxiety hierarchy. It is the patient who decides when and if they are ready to take the next step on their hierarchy, and some patients may never complete all the steps within their hierarchy. Our counter-argument has focused on systematic desensitisation as the other behavioural therapy. We've been clear here how it's not directive, how the patient and therapist are working together, and in fact in many stages in systematic desensitisation, the patient is in control and in charge. Let's link this all together and form a judgment. Clinicians have to be aware of their expert power and the ability to shape behaviour in treatment. The implementation of the HCPC guidelines recognises this by adding ethical guidelines for clinicians, ensuring that psychology is not used to negatively control. We've been clear in our judgment here that we need an awareness of our expert power in order to prevent it from becoming abusive. Introducing the idea of the HCP guidelines in recognition of the possibility of abuse shows a wider and deeper psychological knowledge. It's time for a final balanced conclusion, in order to give judgments and respond to that assess command word. Learning theories have developed therapies that have helped individuals deal with phobias and control their behaviour. An understanding of the impact of role models enables positive behaviours to be encouraged through the media, improving society. And finally, the ability to change behaviour using learning theories can be abused, as those with power decide which behaviours are positive or should be punished within society. Assess the impact of culture and gender in social and cognitive psychology, 12 marks. Here we have the command word assess. We need to explain and evaluate, but with assess as our command word, we also need to form some judgments in relation to our question. We need to explain key components of culture and gender as an issue or debate. There are 6 marks available for AO1, or our explanation and knowledge of these debates, so we need a wide variety of key concepts. There are also 6 marks of evaluation available for this question, which means we need to focus our strengths and weaknesses on both social and cognitive psychology. We're going to start with culture as one of our issues and debates, and we're going to explain some key concepts in relation to culture. In psychology, cultures are described as individualistic, where the needs of the individual are held as the most important. Alternatively, cultures can be described as collectivist, where the needs of the group are more important than those of the individual. We've identified both individualistic and collectivist cultures as key terminology within culture as a debate. More importantly, we've explained what this means in terms of how groups interact within these cultures. We're then going to make a point about the impact of culture within our topics. Social psychology is significantly influenced by culture, as the nature of prejudice and obedience varies in different cultures. We've identified key behaviours within social psychology in terms of prejudice and obedience, and we've linked culture to these specifically. We're then going to explain some research that backs up this point. Weatherall found that Polynesian children were fairer in their allocation of points to an outgroup compared to their white classmates in a replication of Tajfel's study. Our comparison between Polynesian and white children, or white New Zealand children, in this particular study shows how cultural differences are having an impact in allocation of points, which is how they measured prejudice. To elaborate, we're going to make a link between culture and cognitive psychology. Bartlett's War of the Ghost study also shows that memory is affected by culture. Schema are based on cultural experiences that make details more likely or difficult to recall. In his study, participants changed canoe to boat to fit their schema. Here we've identified both a theory, schema theory and reconstructive memory, that's affected by culture, and given specific findings for Bartlett's War of the Ghost study. Because our command word is assess, we're then going to make a judgment about the impact of culture. Culture has a significant impact on both social and cognitive psychology. We've been definitive in our judgment here, saying it has a significant impact. We're then going to move back into our explanation. If behaviours are seen cross-culturally, they are universal, suggesting that some behaviours are adaptive and not affected by culture. Here we've identified a research method in order to investigate culture in terms of cross-cultural research. We've also identified a counter-argument in terms of behaviours being worldwide or seen in every culture, which would mean that culture itself is not having an impact on human behaviour. It's time to get evaluating once again. Obedience to authority figures is displayed in all cultures, suggesting that following a legitimate source of authority has become an evolved behaviour to help survival. We've started with social psychology, identifying a particular theory. Legitimate sources of authority within agency theory is likely to be universal because obedience is also seen in every country. We're going to support this by explaining some specific research. Blass found that obedience in 8 non-US countries was a similar percentage on average to US replications, suggesting that obedience is adaptive. If we've got a similar percentage of obedience between different countries, as Blass research suggests, then it's likely that obedience is an adaptive innate response that has evolved. This is giving a clear counter-argument that culture isn't having an impact on social psychology. We're going to look at our other topic now in terms of cognitive psychology. Memory stores in terms of sensory memory, short-term memory and long-term memory are similar in all cultures. There are also no cultural differences in terms of attention, maintenance, rehearsal and retrieval, suggesting that memory is based on nature. Again, we've shown a wide understanding of different things within memory and different explanations. We've talked about different stores in terms of sensory memory, short-term memory and long-term memory, and we've also identified different processes. By suggesting that this is nature, we're saying that culture isn't having an impact. So it's time to come to a judgment once again. The impact of culture needs to be examined carefully and may apply to behaviours in varying degrees. Although we've sat on the fence here, we've still given a clear judgment. We're kind of saying that this is going to apply different behaviours differently, and I realise that that's a bit wishy-washy, but we're still giving a judgment here. It's now time to explore the other part of our question and ensure that we are addressing all parts of the question we've been given. So let's move on to gender. Gender can affect psychological research as samples are androcentric, with generalisations being made from only male participants to women. An androcentric approach may also mean that only behaviour or clinical disorders affecting men are investigated by psychologists. We've explored the term androcentric in detail here, talking about both samples and the nature of research. It's time to go back into evaluation once again. The impact of gender on obedience is difficult to establish due to mixed empirical data. We're saying that the research evidence or the studies collected on obedience and gender as a factor are giving us mixed results. We could also use the term external reliability here to give a similar idea. To explain, we're going to explore the impact of gender on obedience. Milgram's baseline study only used 40 male participants, which was then used to make generalisations about female participants. Women are more likely to be socialised as obedient and have more social repercussions if they are not, which would affect their levels of obedience to legitimate authority figures. In our discussion here, we've identified the androcentric nature of Milgram's original baseline study. We've also said, and more importantly here, discussed how this might have an impact on obedience in terms of socialisation. We're going to give a counter-argument here and discuss how this might not be a significant issue. However, Berger's replication of Milgram's study included both male and female participants. They found that gender did not have a significant impact on obedience to the experimenter as an authority figure. We've got specific findings from Berger's research here to show our psychological knowledge and that the androcentric sample from Milgram's original baseline doesn't actually have an impact on our understanding of obedience. It's time to link this back to our question and give a judgment. Therefore, differences in social norms around gender may have impacted results that have been conducted in different decades. We're introducing a different factor here and suggesting that the time and socialisation of gender might have an impact on the results and the differences between Berger and Milgram studies. We're going to go back to explanation once again, explaining some more concepts within gender. Alpha bias is when research overestimates gender differences in behaviour. Beta bias is when research ignores or underestimates gender differences due to androcentric samples being used. We've clearly explained our terminology here, with alpha bias overestimating gender differences, saying men and women are completely different, and beta bias saying that there's an underestimation of gender differences, and that's saying that ignores the fact that different socialisation processes might occur. It's time to consider gender in relation to cognitive psychology now. There may be some differences in memory according to gender, such as memory for facial expressions or memories that involve emotion. By discussing different types of memory, we're giving a clearer and deeper exploration of our psychological knowledge. We then need to explain why this difference might occur. Brain scans on women have found that they have larger language centres in the temporal lobe. Studies on children may show gender differences on the recall of word lists, but this may be due to structural differences in the brain. We've used our understanding of brain scans and language centres in order to discuss the impact on memory. that if we've got differences in terms of our capacity to remember language, then that might show developmental differences between girls and boys in early studies on word lists. It's time to give a counter-argument in order to show those logical chains of reasoning. However, memory as a process does not seem to be affected by gender, with the nature of attention, maintenance, rehearsal and retrieval involving the hippocampus and temporal lobe in both male and female participants. We've drawn our attention back to the processes within memory. We've also identified both the hippocampus and the temporal lobe as brain structures consistent across different genders in the recall of memory more generally. In order to complete our evaluation paragraph, we want to come to another link and judgment in relation to the impact of gender. The focus of cognitive research on age as a primary factor in the development of dementia has taken precedent in cognitive research. Here we're suggesting that other factors are more influential, and the focus of cognitive research has focused on these because of their impact on memory. Here we've specifically identified age, but you could use other examples. So our final job in our response is to give a conclusion that gives some clear judgments. Empiricism supports that culture has a significant impact on social psychology. Schemas affect how memory encodes, which demonstrates that culture has an impact in cognitive psychology. The impact of gender on obedience has been extensively researched, with mixed results suggesting that other participant variables may have a confounding effect. And finally, the changing nature of social norms makes the impact of gender in social psychology difficult to test. You can complete a unique version of this paper by going to our Psychology Ninjas site. Psychology Ninjas is full of free content to help you with your exams. You can save your scores with a free account.